Hello and welcome to episode 544 of The Journey. This is a conversation on culture, leadership, and creativity. I still remember that Tuesday, if I'm not mistaken, it was a Tuesday morning. We woke up, we were in Germany, we were doing our traditional and yearly soccer camp event. This is 6 years ago, this coming Saturday. And I woke up, I had the privilege, and again, Germany is a country that is going to be around 7 to 8 hours ahead of us. So we woke up, we pray, we thought about it, and the reality is that it was legalized 6 years ago. This Saturday, it was legalized same-sex marriage across all 50 states in United States of America. And again, we were in a foreign country. We were seeing the transformation of our culture completely changing in front of us. And by the time we came back to United States, as we have known the country, were never to be the same again. And our podcast today is not necessarily just about the changes that are taking place, whether we agree or not in our culture, but it's for us to filter and to be reminded, because we've been talking over the issue of fatherhood. We're coming from the weekend where we, as a family, I personally did not have a chance to do our traditional podcast, and I had the privilege to preach, though, so I was able to present the gospel over this weekend, specifically on Father's Day. But to me, again, and I explained a little bit of this yesterday, Father's Day plays such a major role, not just because we love to be fathers, and tragically, less and less men are becoming fathers because of delayed marriage, because of not wanting to have kids. But in reality, the concept of fatherhood is a great opportunity not only to reflect and to express God's original plan on what He wants and desires to do in our culture, because I think fathers represent a major component because of the privilege that we get, not because we're better, not because we have a better position, but it's simply the responsibility, the privilege that we get, and the function that we actually are called to exercise in the context of family and relationships. But specifically, again, when we look at our nation, and again, we're fixing to this Saturday, which is the 26th of June, is going to be the 6th anniversary of this major transition in our culture. And all that I'm saying, and here's what I want us to just, I guess, talk for a little while this morning, is not about agreeing on whether we agree on what happened or we disagree on what happened. I think for me, the issue more than anything else is the understanding that as men, as fathers, we get the privilege and the opportunity to help our families, to help each other, to understand and to navigate all these changes that have just created a domino effect, whether we agree or not on those changes. Now, obviously, because this is a podcast that processes things through the lenses of the scriptures, I do have to bring up, the biblical view over some of these changes, because we do not worship change. I know change is unavoidable. I know some of us, we thrive into change. I know some of us, we struggle with change, and regardless, I think the Bible is very clear when help us, and again, this is the concept of the understanding of fatherhood, to help us understand that change has to be filtered through the object of the change. In other words, we don't change for the sake of change. We're not victims of change. We understand that the Bible presents God as the ultimate authority, as the ultimate and supreme determination, and how this is going to be, and it's been unfold, where even the changes that we are foreseeing today, the changes that we are unavoidably facing today, they must be filtered through the lenses of the God of the Bible. This is the God that we worship. This is the God that established these principles from day one. And the beauty of our conversation today, and again, coming back to fatherhood, is that God is not surprised by those changes. Now, 2,000 years ago, and we've been talking about Matthew chapter 13. 2,000 years ago, Jesus is confronted with a generation that desired change, had preconceived ideas of change, and unavoidably was changing. And Jesus comes into the picture, specifically Matthew in chapter 13. He's going to help us to navigate and to see the words of Jesus, the teachings of Jesus, because again, his words and his teachings are on top of any change that takes place. And we filter change through what Jesus said. And we looked at the multiplicity of parables in chapter 13 of the book of Matthew that he has been unfolding, teaching, presenting. And again, Matthew is going to package those on chapter 13 in his gospel. And when we came into, and this is from yesterday, when we came into verses 51 and 52, Jesus is going to, I guess, in a way, question or dialogue with the audience, which primarily are Jewish people, into the concept of understanding. Do you understand, all these things we said yesterday? And again, just looking back 6 years ago on that, it was a beautiful summer morning in Germany. We woke up, we were doing soccer camp, and the question came for us 6 years ago: Do we understand? Do we understand what's happening? The question wasn't whether we agree or not. The question was, do you understand? And again, if we were to talk about the role that we get to play, the role that we have been commissioned and empowered to fulfill as men, as fathers specifically, it's we have this amazing opportunity to help to bring understanding and clarity. So we closed yesterday. We brought the conversation into a closing by making the statement that if we, and this is what we believe fatherhood or manhood is about, is that understanding is not something that we accomplished. Understanding is not something that we simply strive for. Understanding is not something that we simply, because we are fathers, because we are men, because we are whatever other adjective you want to put into the conversation. Understanding is simply something that happens to us. And again, from a biblical perspective, you see the challenges that we're facing. Again, from the 6th anniversary of redefining what the government legalized as marriage, and then you can bring so many other conversations. You can bring the fact that we are still, facing COVID, and so many uncertainty, so much uncertainty, so many questions. And the point that I'm trying to make is, it will be foolish for men. It will be foolish for you, for me, to simply rely on our own understanding. To try to simply, again, bring our very own self-reliance, self-indulgence to process the changes that are taking place in our world. And this is why we said yesterday that when it comes to Jesus's words, and he is speaking to this generation, he asked them after, again, a series of parables, he says, have you understood all this things? Because of a previous commitment of faith, those are the things that he's been alluding and bringing into the conversation. Tragically, they did not understand. And obviously, we know the rest of the story. They're going to deny, they're going to forsake, and eventually they're going to crucify Jesus because of the lack of understanding. And for them to get this new, we used the terminology yesterday, and we spoke of this. For this new faith commitment, it was based on election, illumination, and decision. It was based on the God who chose, the God who chooses to bring that understanding. So that understanding for us, that ability to understand, to process those things, are based on the character of Jesus, which he is the fulfillment of the words of God, of the scriptures. He is the fulfillment of that. And so that concept of election, that the Father chose the Son, and through the Son he chose the many. He chose the world to himself. So this process of the new commitment is not the better version of ourselves. And this is why, coming back into, again, we're going through so many changes, and giving the benefit of the doubt to each other and to our culture, I think that part of our lack of understanding is to think that the changes are for the betterment of ourselves. I don't believe the Bible opposes the betterment of each other and to improve on whatever we are and to strive for improvement. But would it be possible that maybe part of that lack of understanding is for us to pause for a moment and simply realize that whatever it is that we're doing, it's not working? I mean, things are not getting better. Things are more confusing. And probably or potentially, this is exactly because we have made the mistake to think that this concept of understanding is something that we get to do. And again, based on the words of Jesus, based on the parables of Jesus, Jesus is pointing towards a brand new faith commitment that it cannot be translated exclusively just over something that you and I believe, over just again ideas or maybe sentimental feelings or maybe values, and even when it comes to our our ability to put our trust on something or someone. But would it be possible that this new faith commitment has to do with the faith or the faithfulness of someone else besides ourselves? This is when we get into the dependence, the trusting on the trustworthiness of someone else, which in this case is got to be Jesus. So I'm saying all this because again, we got a generation, we are a generation that tragically we have misunderstood and we have confused these conversations by simply assuming that if you're honest, if you're sincere, if you can just be transparent, and real with yourself, that justifies whatever changes you may be experiencing or want to experience in your life. But the reality is, again, that Jesus brings these teachings into the understanding that this is a brand new faith commitment based on the fulfillment of that faith. So it's not just the improvement of faith, but it's the fulfillment of that faith. In other words, the Jewish people 2,000 years ago, as much as they were called to trust, to believe, God very clearly specified the object of that trust and that belief. And that object was supposed to be himself, God. And tragically, these people 2,000 years ago, they eventually started exalting, they started idolizing, and I believe they went to the point of just demonizing their very own values and their own understanding, because they put themselves about, what God has established. For some reason, I get the impression that this is exactly where we are today. For some reason, I get the impression that, again, honesty, transparency, even conviction, we have idolized and exalted and even demonized, our self-reliance, our autonomy. And I think this is why, when it comes to this past weekend of our fatherhood, and just continue the conversation on the role that we play as men, we get the privilege right now, again, to bring clarity and understanding into all of these changes and transformations that we are facing today. So the question comes, when you and I, as fathers, maybe as business owners, maybe as pastors and ministers, maybe as a single man, when we see the confusion, maybe when we see family and we see a generation that is looking for leadership, is looking for guidance, is looking for clarity, would it be possible that this is the day where we pause for a moment and realize that the antidote of the confusion, again, is not simply just more training, more podcasts, more sermons, but maybe potentially the antidote or the answer to all this confusion is a person. And this is why we've been using the word new faith commitment, because this is the faith of Jesus. This is the commitment that Jesus has to his heavenly Father. So this is not just our commitment to God. I think our commitment to God must be the result of the commitment of Jesus to the Father. Otherwise, we're going to leave it up to us to define what that commitment looks like. It's going to be up to us to define what that faith, in God, or faith trusting in God looks like. And this is why we're trying to take up kind of a parenthesis, a pause, and say during this season where we are talking about men and the role that we play in the leadership, the task, the privilege that we get to lead, to serve, to sacrifice, to give. This is the moment that we have to come back and recognize that this is not, again, just simply the better version of ourselves. This is about the character and the person of Jesus. And I'm going to say this again. This is why when it comes to understanding, navigating, processing, bringing clarity, this is not something that men are called to do. This is something that happens to men. This is when we as men, we surrender, we yield, we simply come before the person of Jesus, that we are not, we're not in love, we're not seeking what Jesus brings into the picture, which in this case, hopefully is understanding, but we simply love Jesus. We simply, focus on the person of Jesus. And again, because since understanding is not something that we achieve or seek or work for, this is something that happens to us. The question that I want us to just, I guess, close our time together on this understanding and something that, again, happens to us. The question is, what is it that happens to us? What does understanding comes into the picture? And I'm going to use again my analogy of 6 years ago. Germany, foreign country. When we left, our country was a little different in that regard. When we came back from Germany, it was a total different ball game, because obviously the legalization of same-sex marriage, all these transitions that we have done, which, by the way, I just want to remind each other that this is not simply, the issue is not same-sex marriage. The issue is simply morality. And when the church, tragically, Christians, we are so prompt to look at the speck of whether it's society or culture at the expense of our own log. We got to be careful with that. And this is why we come back to understanding, because the standard is not simply what I believe or what I think the Bible says. The standard is the fulfillment of the Bible. The standard is the person of Jesus. That's all that I'm saying. See, Jesus sets the standards. Jesus is actually who sets supreme authority over every single issue. Now, I'm bringing this up again as a closing, because this thing that has happened to us, this understanding that has happened to us, is nothing else but God's redemptive, eternal plan. When Jesus speaks these parables in chapter 13, on chapter 13 of the book of Matthew, he is unfolding, he is reminding, he is reintroducing the plan, the strategy, the sovereignty of God that he established before the creation of the world. So the teachings of Jesus, the life of Jesus, is a fulfillment of that plan. Is God simply, not just teaching about the plan, but he is the embodiment of that plan. He is the purpose. He is the reason. And again, when we talk about, how understanding is what happens to us, our heart's desire, hopefully today's podcast, is about us understanding that ultimately, the purpose, the goal is not to remain confused or avoid confusion, that the purpose is not just to have clarity, but the purpose is to understand that God's redemptive plan is taking place in spite of and regardless of, even in the context of a lot of, again, confusion, misunderstanding, and lack of understanding, lack of knowledge. God's redemptive plan is taking place, will take place. God is not trying to figure out what to do with our generation, with COVID, with finances and relationships. God, that's not the God of the Bible. And Jesus is bringing that conversation over and over and over again. Tragically, the generation 2,000 years ago, which I don't believe we are too distant from the same attitude and the same mindset, is that tragically they did not see Jesus as a fulfillment of that plan. In other words, they were for God's plan, they were for God's redemptive, work and intervention in history, except nobody expected for God to show up. They wanted God's intervention. They wanted God's understanding and clarity. They just never thought that understanding, that plan was going to be embodied in the person of Jesus Christ. And this is why, I'm going to say that again. Jesus is that plan. Jesus is literally the will, the purpose, the fulfillment. This is God himself walking among us. And since Jesus is that embodiment, Jesus is the incarnation, the expression, the crystallization, the fulfillment of the Word of God, since that's the case, it is Jesus who determines also the purpose for that plan. So again, he is the plan, he also sets the purposes for why and that plan was given. And again, this is extremely important, because just going back to the analogy of the 6th anniversary of the legalization of same-sex marriage, that's exactly the same deal. Because think about it, when it comes to marriage, when it comes to relationships, when it comes to men, women, when it comes to life, tragically, most of us, we are okay with God being the creator of those things. God established marriage. God established a man, a woman, whatever. God did those things. But then we think that we can determine the purpose for that. And this is where we get into the redefinition of things. This is where we as Christians, we as men and women, we get into so much trouble because we conveniently affirm some of these biblical principles at the expense of defining them or redefining them according to our own understanding. And this is when we get into a lot of trouble. And I'm going to say this again, is not working. I don't think it's working. I think we are in deep need of men and women that will remind themselves, that will come back to understand that this is not about simply avoiding confusion, that this is not simply about the betterment of our generation and our children and in the future generation. This is about the person of Jesus, that he is the embodiment of understanding, that he is the God of the Bible made flesh, walked among us. And again, his teachings are pointing, these parables are pointing to a person, not just head knowledge, not just, again, better grasp of things and clarity on life. This is the person of Jesus, and this person has not only again reflected, expressed, being God incarnate, but this is the same person that determines the purpose of why, the purpose of the plan, how this plan is to be executed. So on a Tuesday morning, the invitation is that we are reminded that the understanding of life for you and I, the purpose of this understanding just flows and comes out of the scriptures, comes out of the teachings, comes out of the word of mouth, comes the Jesus who spoke and who presented this message. And then also it is for that teaching, it is for the scriptures that we are also brought into the understanding. So if you can picture yourself, receiving and getting the understanding from the scriptures, and then understanding that once you receive that, the reason why you receive that is exactly the scriptures. So the Bible is that brings into the understanding, brings into the knowledge, brings into the ability to recognize that in this case, Jesus is the plan of God. Jesus is the fulfillment. Jesus is the purpose. Jesus literally is God himself. But then once you come into that realization, it is for the Bible. It is for the scriptures. It is for that knowledge that you and I come into the realization itself. This is extremely important, again, on a generation where we are only a few days from celebrating this, recognizing or remembering the anniversary of the legalization that happened 6 years ago. And as we see the transformation of our culture, may the Lord allows us to continue to be the generation that we are literally grounded in the understanding that when Jesus asked the question, do you understand all these things? Have you understood all these things? Hopefully we are at the place that understanding the things that Jesus said is not simply to avoid error, to avoid tragedy, to avoid eventually hell. That this is the understanding of the things that Jesus said was exclusively and primarily about understanding who he was. 2,000 years ago, that generation did not understand that. They had their own preconceived ideas of who Jesus was supposed to be and do. Tragically, they agree with his teachings in a sense that they were okay with this rabbi teaching about God, but they never expected for God to be the one coming, dwelling, walking among us. And that's exactly what happened 2,000 years ago. So hopefully, again, all these transitions that we're facing reminds us, brings us, and points us towards the person of Jesus, because that's exactly where understanding flows and where this is coming from. I do hope and you guys have a wonderful rest of this week, specifically today on a Tuesday, which is the 22nd of the month of June. And we will see you guys next time. God bless.